And we're live. Hello, and welcome to Debut Spotlight. I'm Rachel Barenbaum, author of the forthcoming novel Atomic Anna, and I'm super excited for my guest today. His name is Sequoia Nagamatsu, and his amazing debut, there it is, we both have it, How High We Go in the Dark, just dropped. It is so good. It's being reviewed everywhere. All kinds of people have things to say about it, and today we're going to hear what Sequoia has to say about it. I can't wait. So before we hear from him, let me just introduce him quickly. Hello, Sequoia.
Hello.
Reading from his bio, it says, Sequoia Nagamatsu is a Japanese-American writer and the managing editor of Psychopomp magazine. Originally from Hawaii and the San Francisco Bay Area, he holds an MFA in creative writing from Southern Illinois University. He's the author of the award-winning short story collection, Where We Go When All We Were Is Gone. And his work has appeared in such publications as Conjunctions, The Southern Review, Ziziva, Fairy Tale Review, and Tin House, among others. He currently lives in Minnesota with his wife, their cat, and a robot dog named Calvino. Yes, I will ask him about Calvino. Hello, Sequoia.
Hello.
Tell us. So happy to have you here today. Tell me, what is this beautiful, beautiful book about?
Well, that's a long story, but in a nutshell, it's a multi-generational journey that spans continents and centuries of people reimagining grief and trying to hold on to hope in the aftermath of a climate plague. Yes, there is a plague in this novel. I wrote it pre-COVID, but by and large, the story is focused on the everyday, the small actions that people take to really just wake up the next morning and try to reimagine their futures.
I love that. I also love that you make the point, and I've seen this in other interviews that I've read with you, that these chapters from this book have been published for years, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well before pre-COVID.
Mm-hmm.
So you were more sort of looking into a future than writing is inspired by COVID. But I mean, I have to ask, what's it like to launch a book like this during COVID?
It's surreal. I mean, when my agent and I were deciding to even go out with this, we're like, should we or should we not? Ultimately, we pushed forward and we found some wonderful partners that understood the humanistic vision for the book. But I think, it's published at the right time, if there is ever a right time to publish a book during the pandemic. Because I think in year 3 of COVID, people are finally starting to want to engage in conversations about what the future might be and how this time has actually changed us irrevocably, because it has.
Yeah. You scared me for a moment there. Year 3. That's still,
Yeah.
Oh my God, really? So before we dig into sort of the meat of the story that I really want to ask you about, first want to ask about the structure, because this is very much a set of sort of stories or scenes from people who are dealing with, at first, the discovery of the plague or the sickness, and then, right, sort of the fallout over the years. So do you think of it as a story collection? Sort of how does it sit in your mind?
I think maybe a novel in stories is an apt description for it.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you're calling it a story collection, people are apt to maybe skip around or sort of like see each chapter as standalone pieces. And while you might be able to look at a certain chapter as having a certain being able to give you some kind of joy or fulfillment, there is a larger narrative. There are characters that are related to each other, that connect. There is an evolution of the world. And there's also a narrative thread that holds everything together that, you come to realize by the time you get to that last chapter. And so there's a lot of Easter eggs and a lot of hints that I dropped throughout that people would miss out on if they treated it like a story collection, and certainly if they read out of order.
Yeah, I love that, a novel in stories, because I've read a bunch of the reviews that have come out, and I've read different descriptions, but I think novel in stories is the best. We'll go with what the author says on this one. Okay, so I wanted to read this one passage where you begin with a father basically is mourning the loss of his daughter. She's died around the discovery of a Neanderthal little girl. I guess this is sort of the beginning of what unleashes the plague. I'm not giving away any spoilers. This is like the first few pages of the book, okay? And he's standing there and he writes a letter to her. And I just wanted to read one of the very moving lines. So this is very early on in the book, and it says, he writes, "You saw a future of dead soil and dead oceans, all of us fighting for our lives. You had a vision of what life would be like for future generations and acted like the planet had a gun to our head. And maybe it does. I was always so proud of you, but it took Siberia, a quarantine, and the mystery of a 30,000-year-old girl to help me realize that. Maybe tonight I'll look at the stars and make up a new constellation for the both of us. A woman standing at the precipice of a great chasm. I'll be here with you." So first, I love that because there's the emotion, right? And I really feel the mourning and the sadness, right? He's reaching to his daughter, but also it gives us sort of, in a nutshell, how you are looking at our world, right? That we are holding, a gun to the earth, right? To our head. And I wonder if you could talk about that and the inspiration of, environmental destruction in this book.
Yeah, I mean, like I have a kind of a past with environmental activism, and climate change, forest issues have always been near and dear to my heart. So injecting those messages into the book was always a consideration of mine. But when I was thinking about the plague narrative, I think it made sense to me that the plague was an apt metaphor for climate change. And certainly how we respond to something like a pandemic, there are some very clear parallels to how we respond or not, how we ignore certain things regarding, this plague or in our world, COVID-19. I think with that particular line that you just read, I wanted to really highlight the fact that, even though that narrator is a scientist, the primary focus is essentially their hearts. I'm never privileging their roles in the government or society at large. I'm almost always privileging their relationships and the quieter moments of when they go home versus how they're solving or racing to find a cure. This isn't Dustin Hoffman in Outbreak.
Right. But I have to tell you, so a few years ago, I remember before COVID, right? Long before COVID, I started reading about fears of the permafrost melting and what was going to, come up in the sludge. And this is not something that, although you're brilliant, you did not invent this idea, right? That disease and plagues might come up and defrost from there. So I was wondering, where did you start, reading about it or thinking about it? I remember the 60 Minutes episode that I saw very clearly where they showed, right, this guy up there working to maintain the permafrost to keep back the plague.
Yeah, I feel like we keep seeing more and more articles about this. But it was in 2014 when the plague narrative sort of entered the project. And it was in an Atlantic article about 30,000-year-old viruses, ancient viruses. So hence the chapter title that opens the book. And while most scientists think that it's unlikely that a world devastating virus could be unleashed from ice melt, it's not something that's written off. It's still within the realm of something that we need to watch out for. And that really intrigued me because, again, there was that climate aspect. This is something that we are bringing about. We're unlocking the past that should stay in the past. But it's also something that could be a vehicle for a lot of the stories I had already written that were tied together by this grief, by funerary practices that I was just really fascinated by.
Wow. That's amazing. So you bookend literally the book, right? Because then, this passage that I just read that I loved, and then I get to the end, and we're here around page 279, and we get to. You don't have to look it up. I'm going to read it to you, okay. For any listeners that might want to. But then this idea,
I'm a professor.
Yeah, I love it though. Yeah. Right, with our agency and our ability, right? What we as humans can still do to the earth, and so here we are, very far in the future. Very far. You wrote, "I came upon my husband in the seed fields, showing Nuri how world builders inject possibility into each seed, adding with trained precision the chemicals and minerals we debate for thousands of years. It's not entirely up to you," my husband explained to Nuri. We plant potential realities. What we see through our scopes may or may not happen, at least in this universe. So who decides? Nori asked. Some of it's chance, I explained. Hope, love, ingenuity, possibility is more than what runs through our veins, little one. Mm-hmm. I just thought what a beautiful way to end, because there's a lot of sadness in this book, but you end on hope.
Right.
Can you talk about that?
I think even in the very early chapters, and I think the first 2 chapters are probably the roughest, but even then, especially in revisions, I wanted to make sure that there was a little hope, even in the darkest moments, and that hope would slowly compound by the time we got to the end. Because, and I've said this to other interviewers, what's the point of waking up if you've lost sight of that hope? Like, I think it's very easy for us to turn on the news these days and feel like it's hopeless sometimes. But I think if you're able to even latch on to smaller actions, smaller moments, small goals, whether that's family or your community or doing something for the larger world, that can be enough energy to kind of push you through to the next day, to the next year. And I think that's the kind of collective thinking, communal thinking that I want readers to take away from this book, is this the idea of possibility, of hope, and also communal action, that we can kind of find answers to, make the world a little bit of a better place.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I think that's why I think there's a way to read this book in which there's a lot of sadness. And you've said this book is about mourning and grieving. But I did find at the end, I thought you are a hopeful person. Yeah. Or at least you had hope in there. And that's,
right.
was the beauty of the book. So then I want to talk about the sickness itself, the plague. It's the way that it kills people is it transforms different organs into it's sort of what they shouldn't be or should be, right? A heart into a brain or something like that. So obviously to me, that screams transformation as one of the big themes of the book, right? As the earth is transforming, we are transforming. So I have to ask you, please talk about transformation in the book.
I mean, it really kind of ties to something that you nodded at with those lines that you just read, this idea of possibility. Right? Transformation and possibility are kind of sort of like, 2 sides of the same coin. And I thought that, the plague in and of itself is insidious. And of course, it's devastating. But the virus isn't trying to kill people. It's essentially seeking possibility. It's seeking changes. And that's something that I've tried to kind of, carry forward in terms of humanity's response to a virus like this, where the possibility, in our responses to something so devastating, we have agency over that. We have agency to respond in ways that could be very transformative for our individual lives, for our society, or we could respond in ways that are, basically keeping the status quo. And I'm of course talking about the novel, but I'm also talking about our reality as well.
Yes, I mean, it was like, this is for an English class or a literature class, right? The theme for a paper, transformation, exactly. And, Sequoia Nagamatsu's, debut novel. But I also saw it, but there's the hope and that transformation can be good, but it's killing people, right? So you clearly see it as something that could be bad. Also, it's in the book as something. Could you talk about that bad side too?
Yeah, I mean, and maybe this is something that, I've chosen to embrace a lot of good actors in the book. I think there are, if anything's fictional, it's somewhat devoid of a lot of bad actors. I think there's some conspiracy theorists, and we'll see some of that in the book. But the bad actors, the kind of the negative effects of the plague, I wanted to sort of just nod at the fact that, it is killing people. That's something that is devastating to the world in the book. But we don't want to dwell in the darkness. In terms of our responses, we need to allow ourselves to cry. We need to allow ourselves to grieve and create spaces for that grief. And we often don't do that in our world. But there comes a point where we need to acknowledge that that we need to move forward into the light. We need to put down whatever support system that we have that's enabling us to stay in the dark, whether that's a virtual reality headset or a robot dog or whatever piece of technology that's helped us up to a point, but is still holding us back.
Yeah. So I want to dig back into, I think you're touching on this theme, but I want to really, go into it. This question of mourning. And you've said this is a book about mourning. So please talk to me about that. How do you see that?
Yeah. I mean, the early seeds of the book, it really began, I think, with my own grief and kind of coming to terms with losses of my grandfather. And there's just a lot of, I think, certainly loss there, but also guilt just in terms of not being there in the way that I should have. And I realized that, both in my experiences and with other people, death isn't something that we talk about. It's a very uncomfortable subject, and it's a subject that has become very commercialized. You cry, and then you plan a funeral, and then you worry about money. And there's not a lot of space in 20th, 21st century to actually honor the dead in the way that they probably should be, and to actually have a dialogue with our memories about that person. And so in the book, I explored different ways that corporations were both exploiting this mass death because of the plague, because they wanted to fill their pockets, but at the same time, they were providing a necessary service in terms of reimagining this grief and mourning and providing a space for people to actually say goodbye in a world where our traditional forms of grief were no longer possible because of quarantine, because of hospital overloads, because of morgue overloads, and so on and so forth. And we saw that to some degree with COVID. People have not been able to kind of go into hospitals and hold their loved ones' hands. There have been iPad goodbyes. But even when my father passed away like about a year and a half ago, like one of my first reactions was to tweet about it. And I found that to be a very cathartic experience, this kind of community of mourning with near perfect strangers on the internet.
Yeah. Amazing. And I feel like you just handed me the perfect segue into talking about City of Laughter, right? Which is a story in which, why don't you sum it up for me, please?
Well, so at this point, the plague has reached the mainland United States, and it's infected children first, and hospitals have been overloaded. And as a response to this, the government, in concert with some corporations, have created this theme park to, I guess, as a gentle alternative, if you want to call it that, for families to spend a final day of joy and laughter with their children. And the final ride is a roller coaster. It's an actual thought experiment from an architect that is, it's essentially a series of loops that induces euphoria and unconsciousness, and ultimately euthanizes you. And so the story follows one of the employees of this park as he forms a bond with one of the children.
Yeah. I mean, that story is so sad, right? It is heartbreaking. You're talking about euthanizing children, giving them a gentle death. That the parents can be there and, see their children off. And yet at the same time, this employee is wearing this giant mouse costume, right? And talking about sweating inside. And there's the absurdity of modernity, built into this story. And I couldn't help but wonder if this was also a commentary on the absurdity of, the presence of Twitter, for example, in our life, or the technology, right? Or us not being able to face grief head on, and instead, making a city of laughter as a way in.
I mean, some of it is kind of like not an absurdity, but the fact that the absurdity is sometimes necessary, like what we might sort of see as absurd or, maybe a little dark is actually something that's kind of comforting.
Yes.
And I think that really just sort of like goes to show like how much we've changed culturally because of something like social media. Our behavior is just mind-boggling to somebody. Let's say if we're talking to ourselves from the 80s and we told them that, oh yeah, I told thousands of people that my father died, and it was really helpful. It's just such a relatively new phenomenon that I think we still need to actually articulate.
I love that answer, because here you go again with the hope, right?
Yeah.
Injecting hope into modernity and where the world is today. So, and that is what I think is in the story in the end too, right? That there is, in this horrible plague, there are good ways to die, right? If that is possible. So, yeah. All right. So I want to move on to a different story. It was called, I believe it's called Pig Son. So please, again, tell me, what is Pig Son about?
Well, so at this point, with the scientist in this chapter, he's actually the father of the little boy who died in a previous chapter, and he failed to save him. His work is focusing on creating human organs in organ donor pigs, so that he can buy people more time, and he couldn't do that for his son. The pigs are genetically modified, and one particular pig develops the capacity for human speech, at least via telepathy. And the scientists—
I just love that you said that with a straight face.
Yeah.
Let me just tell you, this is why I wanted you to tell me what the story is about. Yes.
Well, it's become normalized, it's
yes.
In my mind, it's just it's notorious PIG is part of the family, right? And
yes. That is the best name ever.
Right,
wait, can you say it again, please, just so all of our listeners hear? The name of the pig is
Notorious PIG. Yeah.
Amazing.
Right. Yeah. And this pig forms a bond, and vice versa. The scientist forms a bond with this pig, and this pig kind of becomes a bridge for this narrator to find some closure, I think, over the loss of his son. And the pig ultimately does, kind of sacrifice himself and acknowledges the state of the world. Not just to be, not to help the world at large, but I think the pig makes the sacrifice ultimately because he loves the people that have cared about him. He does it for his family.
But he loves the people that have cared about him, and yet he was made as an experiment, right? And people want to kill him.
Right.
For his. So can you talk about that duality there?
Yeah, I mean, like, certainly when I thought about this chapter, animal rights was kind of like at the forefront of my mind. How we exploit non-human beings on our planet to forward innovation, or just to exploit them for no good reason whatsoever. And so I thought about what would happen to what's kind of the moral question if these animals could speak, and what would that relationship look like, between a scientist and his subject. And so, yes, ultimately, these pigs are killed, and in order to sort of save humanity, or at least buy them more time, most of the pigs don't get a say in that or a choice in that. This pig does. Ultimately, sort of chooses, to help out, in part because there's this weird connection between the pig and the scientist's dead son. It's like, I want to do this for Fitch. I want to do this for your dead son. And I think part of the impetus, part of the origins of this particular chapter, I think, came from I Never Let Me Go, I think was a narrative that was not too far from my mind when I thought about this.
Yes, I'm so glad you said that, because I was totally thinking about that book as I was reading it. But at the same time, right, the scientist is finding comfort with a pig, not a human, right? Not his ex-wife, not right. He's with the pig. Can you talk about that?
Well, I think it's valuable for readers to recognize humanity in the non-human, and because I think we often talk about humanity, defining humanity as having certain qualities that really aren't exclusive to our species.
Yes.
We know this. Scientists have studied this behavior. We know that dolphins, we know that pigs, we know these other animals have capacity for particular emotions and community and even language. And yet. So I thought that was important to kind of have that message in this chapter. There is already a non-human, an extraterrestrial alien presence in the novel that is in some ways the most human being in the book, because we have this this character that's existed for billions of years, is immortal, and is kind of practicing humanity, practicing being human over the years. So what could be more human than that? You're failing upward. And
but I'm so glad that you really have this animal view in here, because so I have a very strong vegan teenager in my house who reminds us all the time that if you ask children, they value animals in their house as much as they value any of the humans in their house. And as we get older, we tend to forget the value, that you can find companionship and comfort and everything you can, with a human that you can with an animal, even if the animal, and so the pig was very human in many ways, very Animal Farm or other, well, except not in that sense, but yes. So I really loved that part. I feel like animal lovers will also love your book. Okay, so we're getting towards the end. I didn't even get to ask you about Calvino yet. So we were sharing our love of Italo Calvino before we started, but I've got to go forward to my last two questions because all of my listeners absolutely love to hear about this from debut authors. So what was the hardest part about getting this book published?
I think, I initially started this book was really, I think, the trajectory of writing it is as long as the trajectory of me being a writer. It took me a very long time to realize this in this particular form. And so I think, if writers are kind of in the trenches feeling despair, which I think we all feel sometimes, I just remind them that was a very long road to write this book. And there were times where I felt like, I'm not sure what this is going to be. I'm not sure what shape this should take. I'm not sure if this will ever get published. But I kept with it because I ultimately believed in the project, and it evolved over time. It evolved as I came across new books that gave me more tools. It evolved as I got my agent and we had dialogues about what this could be or should be. It evolved as I came across an article about a plague, as I bought a robot dog, so on and so forth. And so I think writing this book has really taught me that, writing a novel or writing something as expansive as this, you just really have to allow yourself to explore and let your characters and let your world, take you where the book needs to be.
Can you quantify long time? How long?
About over 10 years.
Over 10 years. Wow. And you stuck with it. So was there any point where it was just, where you're like, what was the hardest moment where you thought, I don't know what I'm going to do?
I mean, as far as the writing, I think I did keep with it, because I think what helped me is that because it is a novel and stories, I sat down to work on particular people that I cared about. And I was able to kind of think about it in more concrete, specific, finite terms. But I also suggest this to my students who are working on more traditional novels, is that you don't want to sit down and say that you're working on a novel, because that'll create a writer's block for you. Sit down and write a scene, sit down and write a chapter, but don't ever sit down at a desk and tell yourself you're writing a novel.
I love that. Well, that was my next question for you, is what kind of advice do you have for new writers? And I feel like that is brilliant. Novels come together scene by scene by scene, not as a novel. So do you have any other advice that you can offer a new writer?
I'd say don't worry about genre conventions or what you think the market wants, because by the time you finish it, the market's going to change. And I think I learned this one the hard way. I think especially as an Asian American writer, and the landscape I think has changed a lot for writers of color. But when I first started out, I thought that the reading public needed a certain kind of story from a Japanese writer. And I wasn't wrong, because a lot of literature being produced, as well written and deserving as those works are, often were coming from a place of othering communities and writing for, I think, a white audience, not always writing on the terms of that author. And so just write for yourself ultimately, and don't worry about your story fitting into certain boxes. Create your own box if you need to.
I love that. Create your own box. That's great. Sequoia, thank you so much for joining me today. I had such a great time talking to you about this amazing new book, How High We Go in the Dark. Run, don't walk to get your copy, and may you sell many, many copies.
Thank you for having me.
Bye, everybody.